Hey there, Alex Kidman here, and today I'm taking a look at this, the Motorola Moto G84 5G. Motorola's latest budget or more affordable phone. It's actually a funny one in this respect because at $399 Australian, it's kind of the high end of their budget phones. They have quite a few cheaper models, and actually it's funny because this year it feels like I haven't been able to go a couple of weeks without reviewing a Motorola phone, and a lot of them have actually been really good value for money. So what does the Moto G84 5G do to stand out? Well, there are a couple of aspects in which I think this is a brilliant phone. There's a couple of things where I figure, actually, this is really good value. There's a couple of other areas, though, where I kind of think, there are other things in the Motorola army of phones that might be better for you. So let's get into what I like about this phone and what I don't. So getting the Motorola Moto G84 5G out of its box felt like a very familiar process because, as I said, I've reviewed a lot of their phones this year, and this one mostly follows their design language. You're talking a flattish phone. Obviously, you're talking the Motorola Batwing logo on the back, fingerprint sensor for unlocking. It's all fairly familiar territory stuff for Motorola phones in 2023. So the Motorola Moto G84 5G measures in at 160 by 74.4 by 7.6 millimeters with a carrying weight of either 166.8 grams or 168.3 grams. Now, why does it have two weights, I hear you ask? Well, it depends on the phone rear casing you pick from. So what I've got here is the Midnight Blue model. That's in plastic, basically, PMMA plastic if you care. But there are also options for Marshmallow Blue or Viva Magenta in vegan leather. And I've talked about vegan leather in previous reviews, including previous Motorola reviews. It's not actually leather, it's actually made from vegans, if you were wondering. It's actually plastic. It's just a different form of plastic with a kind of leathery feel to it. Now, I like the colour of the Viva Magenta. I think that's a really great visual look for a phone, but I know personally I don't like the feel of vegan leather. There's just something about it that sets my nerves on edge. I really don't like it. So this would be the model I would buy if I was buying a G84 5G, but thankfully it doesn't sort of matter. If I really wanted the Viva Magenta or the Marshmallow Blue, then I could still have them without having to put up with a touch of vegan leather because, of course, they include a case in there. And as soon as you slap the case on there, it doesn't matter what the back feels like. I can tap this all day long and it's golden because it just feels like plastic, which is, of course, it all still is, but I don't have that same sensory thing. And obviously, I accept that is 100% maybe on me. That's to do with the way I like the feel of the back of the phone. But the point I'm trying to make here really is, if you've got the opportunity, go hands-on with one of these things. Some people love vegan leather. Some people think, oh yeah, I love that softer feel. Feels great to me. Not to me, maybe to them, maybe to you, but maybe not. Have a go if you can. On the front of the G84 5G, you find a 6.5-inch POLED display with a 2400 by 1080 resolution and support for up to 120 Hz refresh rates. Now that's quite a nice little mix at this price point. Motorola's really been forward with a lot of its phones in terms of offering faster refresh rate screens. And look, it's a step I really do welcome. It is nicer when you're scrolling. It is obviously nicer for gaming. It's just a nice thing to have. And of course, if you don't want it, if you don't care, you dial it down to 60 Hz, you save yourself a bit of battery power. It feels like a win-win to me. The G84 5G is also IP54 rated. Now, that's not the toughest you can get in phones, so don't go immersing this in full water. In fact, basically, this is sort of rated to be vaguely rainproof. It's still nice to at least see an IP rating, because a lot of the cheaper phones in this kind of price bracket, and Motorola used to do this a lot too, we'll just talk about being water repellent, and frankly, most things are water repellent in the sense that they don't instantly absorb water. You wouldn't want a phone that did that. But having an IP rating means, yeah, we have at least tested this. We do know a degree to which it can stand water and dust ingress. On the camera front, look, Motorola's phones in 2023 have tended to offer fair cameras at best. And honestly, the Moto G84 5G is no real exception to that rule. Around the back, you'll find a primary 50-megapixel wide lens paired up with an 8-megapixel ultra-wide lens and a 16-megapixel selfie camera lurking around the front. And look, that's all fairly standard fare. It's kind of surprising in a way that Motorola didn't go for the nearly standard, nearly default 2-megapixel macro lens of awfulness. Instead, the ultra-wide does that duty and doesn't do it terribly well, but none of them really do. And look, I sound like I'm coming down on this hard on the camera. The reality here is that the camera is just average. It's just absolutely what you expect for this price point. It can do an okay job, but I did hit points where the focusing was just a little bit off, or the brightness was just a little bit off. It's not great. It's okay for a lot of daytime shots, for your standard photos. A lot of people will just find this perfectly fine, perfectly acceptable stuff. If you want a better camera phone though, and this is where the G84 perhaps struggles a little more than some of Motorola's other phones, the issue is really that at $399, you are just starting to get up to that kind of true mid-range phone experience, and there the cameras really do start to step up in quality. So if that's important to you, this will do an okay job. If you spend a little bit more, you can get a better than okay job. On the performance side, Motorola's made some really interesting choices here. So I mentioned the G54 5G before, and that's a phone I really like. That was a really good improvement on its predecessor. And part of that was down to the use of a MediaTek Dimensity 7020 processor in it. Now, this is a more expensive phone, the G84 I mean, and what they've gone for here instead is a Snapdragon 695. Now, Snapdragon 695 is an okay mid-range processor, a little bit long in the tooth though, but Motorola gives this a little bit more pep, at least for the model in the Australian market. I know they do variances in international markets, but for the model they're selling here, Snapdragon 695, but you get 12 gig of RAM and 256 gig of onboard storage. You don't see that much RAM and that much storage at this price point all that often. So that's a reasonable sort of deal as long as it's a reasonable sort of performer. And look, it mostly is. It was very interesting putting it up against what I've seen out of the G54 5G. Now, I don't have that phone anymore. It's gone back to Motorola, so I couldn't do an absolute head-to-head. But in terms of the benchmarks, in terms of CPU benchmarks and 3D benchmarks, and I have the full results for those up on my site. I will put a link to the review in the description below. But basically, the G54 5G actually slightly outperformed the 84 5G in CPU, but the G84 did much better in GPU performance. And I think that's an overall balance I prefer. The difference between the CPU speeds was not so big, the GPU was a bit bigger. And you combine that with the 12 gig of RAM on board, and it gives this phone a lot of scope to do just a little bit better. And that's really what I felt like it was doing in more anecdotal usage, in gaming usage, in multitasking. It's not the super fastest phone, because of course, that's your premium phone space, still is, will be, but it is better. It is that little bit snappier, a little bit faster. It's a little bit nicer if you, for example, do want to run slightly more intensive games on it. They will run okay. Again, you are getting what you're paying for, and that older processor perhaps drags it down a little. I would have been really interested to see what, in fact, the Dimensity could have done with that 12 gig of RAM, for example, but it wasn't to be because that's the recipe that Motorola chose. Now, speaking of choices, the G84 5G runs on Android 13, and Motorola's promising 3 years of security patches. That's okay for a phone at this price point, but only the 1 year of OS upgrades. And that only brings it up to Android 14, which is 2023's version of Android. That's not a future-looking statement, really, given when this phone has come out. Motorola keeps doing this, and I don't know why. I wish they offered slightly more support for their phones, because their competitors are. Samsung is doing this. HMD Global/Nokia are doing this. Google obviously is doing this, albeit not on a phone this cheap, to be fair to Motorola. But Motorola feels like it's kind of dragging its feet here. I wish they did slightly more to say, yes, we will give you a bit more long-term surety in this phone. Doesn't mean you can't use it for a good number of years, and it's probably enough to see it out of most people's lifespan of this phone, but more is always better in this case. You do get the usual kind of Motorola actions and their light launcher on top. I don't mind that. It's fairly close to clean Android, which I prefer. But of course, the beauty of Android is you can do what you like with it in terms of launches. You can turn it all sorts of ways, depending on how technical you want to get. I suspect a lot of people will be very happy just with the basic Motorola launcher, though. On the networks front, this is a 5G phone, but as with every other phone not called a Google Pixel Pro of some sort here in Australia, it's sub 6 GHz only. And look, I hit my usual kind of speed marks on that, somewhere between 200 and 400 megahertz, is pretty much what I hit with every phone where I am. So much of this, of course, is dependent on your mobile phone coverage and the towers near you and even the usage they're under at the time you try to test. This was no better or no worse. Millimeter wave might have made that better, but I'm not expecting to see that first in a sub $500 phone. That's just not going to happen. That's maybe also a personal bugbear of mine. If you want 5G, this is fine for what you're going to use 5G for in Australia, really. Like so many of its siblings, nearly all of them save the foldables, I think, the Motorola Moto G84 5G packs in a 5,000 mAh sealed battery. And look, honestly, these days, with these standard form factor Android phones, I'm more surprised when they don't have a 5,000 mAh battery. That's pretty much standard. It is, of course, all about what you do with it and how well it can run. And here, of course, you've also got that 120Hz display to sap down a bit more power if it's going to. So I put this to the test. I ran it, first of all, through my standard YouTube 1 hour streaming test. Now, that's not an exhaustion test, deliberately so. What I'm looking for is to see how low from 100% it drops. Anything that goes under 90%, that's not a phone you should buy, because that's not a phone that's likely to last for a full day. Although, thankfully, very few phones these days seem to drop below that level of the phones that I test. So in that test, the G84 5G dropped to 94%. Not bad. That's okay. That's above my 90% mark. And every percentage point above that is a good thing, because it gives you more and more and more. The issue, though, again, is I returned to the G54 5G, a cheaper phone. It got 96% in the same test. It did a bit better. Now, anecdotal battery life testing is always a bit risky, because what I do with a phone is not necessarily what you do with a phone, not necessarily what the person standing next to you, if there is someone standing next to you, does with the phone either. And what I found, though, was this was a phone that definitely can last a day under most moderate usage. Yes, you can send it flat within that day, because you can do that with just about any phone, let's face it. On the charging front, there's no wireless charging. You wouldn't expect it at this price point, but you do get wired USB-C charging with an included 33-watt charger in the Australian retail box. Again, international markets might vary, though I don't think Motorola's really heavily into that not including a charger game that we see from a number of other providers. So, should you buy the Moto G84 5G? Well, look, it depends. And the reason I say it depends is I like it quite a lot, but I like the G54 5G, and that's $100 cheaper with slightly better battery life. And battery life is really key in these budget phones, because a phone with no power is just a brick. If you need that extra graphics power, though, if you wanted the slightly nicer display screen, and I suppose if you wanted the vegan leather option, it's not for me, but maybe it's for you, then yeah, look, this is a good device. This is a nice device at the right kind of price. It has some really nice inclusions like that extra RAM and the expanded storage. So this is a decent buy, and certainly, obviously, if you can score it a bargain, it's an even better buy. I think I like the G54 5G just slightly more, but this is still good, solid value for money. Anyway, that's my take on the G84 5G. Got anything you want to know? Any comments you'd like to make about the review? Let me know in the comments below, and as always, thanks for watching, and don't forget to hit like and subscribe.